Welcome to the Space Out Podcast, where we chill out, chat about, and space out. I'm your host, Luca, a.k.a. LucaTony, and today we're going to be discussing a recent viral clip from the Joe Rogan podcast, the most biggest podcast ever in the world right now, where Joe Rogan talked about video games and really leisure activities as a whole, if you really think about it. And I have a lot of problems with the things Joe Rogan has said, to the point where I am compelled to make an episode about it. And really, it's just to get my opinion out on the sort of mentality of optimizing your time as much as possible. But we'll get to there in a second. Like, there is some truth in what Joe Rogan has said, but we'll get there in a second. Before we jump into today's episode, however, we have our very first sponsor for the podcast, and that is the very service that provides this podcast to all of you, Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, then how in the world are you listening to this podcast? It's the easiest way to make a podcast, but I'm getting too sidetracked. Let me explain. First of all, it's free. Second of all, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or your computer. No need for a super expensive microphone or the such. You just need to get right into Anchor and record it from there. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and many, many more. That's how I got in all of those platforms relatively easily and relatively fast in the big world of podcasting. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's basically everything you need to make a podcast in one single place. It's great. It took me a lot of researching to find the perfect host for the Space Out podcast, because there's many different variations of like pricing and all of things. But Anchor is free. It works wonders. So why not give it a shot if you haven't already? Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Thank you, Anchor, for the sponsorship. With that out of the way, let me first read you a couple of excerpts, in reality mostly the entire clip of what Joe Rogan has said that's been circling around, in order to give you some idea of what we're talking about. So basically, Joe Rogan opened up with video games are a real problem. Why? Because they're fun. You do them, you get really excited, but you don't get anywhere. You could be obsessed with jiu-jitsu, and 3 years later, you're an elite jiu-jitsu athlete. You're entering competitions, you're moving up. You're doing well, you feel like you might be able to open up a school one day. I can make a living. Or you could be playing video games. 3 years later, you could still be that same kid just playing video games, waiting for the next game to come out, and you're going to waste your time. There are kids that make a lot of money playing video games, but the thing is, you have to be adaptable. You have to be able to play multiple video games. Basically, that's everything that he said in the very now infamous clip that has been circling around, that has gotten responses from pro players and streamers alike all over the internet. Basically, first we're going to talk about what Joe Rogan said is wrong, and then we're going to talk about what Joe Rogan said, why it's right. So, why I have a problem with this, with the clip and what Joe Rogan said. Firstly, let's talk about it in the context of video games. In the example of the he used for jiu-jitsu, not all people that do jiu-jitsu for 3 years become an elite jiu-jitsu athlete. I swam competitively in my high school for 3 years, and I went to competitions, and I got my school a couple of second and first place wins, right? But after that, I didn't want to continue competing, and I still swim 3 years later practically, because moving changes my schedule, and I've been doing high school for a long time. I'm still swimming non-competitively, and I still swim on the daily because I enjoy it. I enjoy the activity of swimming and all of that. That doesn't mean I'm wasting my time. Do you know what I mean? He also said that he had, like, jiu-jitsu athletes have an opportunity to make their school, which most jiu-jitsu athletes, if they don't make it good enough, if they don't make it far enough and make enough money, they probably won't be able to open up a school. Opening up a school is very expensive, and it requires a lot of investment that sometimes people don't have, even if they're really good at something. So not all jiu-jitsu athletes have the opportunity to open a school, nor do they have the desire to open up a school, right? Because, for example, like I said, I love swimming, but I don't like competing in swimming. So some people might just not be into the idea of teaching jiu-jitsu. Secondly, I've played video games for practically my entire life, right? Funny story, I borrowed a friend's Spider-Man 2 game for the PS2 back in 2006 and never gave it back because I liked it so much. It doesn't mean I wasted my time. Video games helped me discover my passion for creative activities to the point where I love storytelling, and I wrote on a 100-page novel, which you can check out on my Storyfire account. Link in the description and in the comment if you're watching on YouTube. But it provided me with the possibility of combining my talents for more mathematical and logical processes that I've always had ever since I was little with storytelling in order to one day become a video game developer. Watching a movie or a TV series or even doing jiu-jitsu for all of your life is no more of a time waste than playing video games. The only thing you could give jiu-jitsu an upper hand to is the fact that it's exercise. But aside from that, as long as you play video games and you exercise beside, like on top of it, you could even play a video game that helps with exercise, like Ring Fit Adventure for the Switch, that makes you do push-ups and sit-ups, and like there is a way to not be quote-unquote a waste of time. And if it is all a waste of time, then everything is a waste of time at the end of the day unless you're working. This very podcast and the Joe Rogan podcast could be considered a waste of time too. If you argue that you learned things from these podcasts and that's the reason why it's not a waste of time, then why couldn't you learn something from video games as well, right? I learned most of what I know, to be completely honest, I learned most of what I know about Greek mythology from playing God of War 2 and my PS2. You can learn important life lessons we used to get from movies and literature through video games as well. Like the recently released Ghost of Tsushima that I'm playing right now. It teaches you all about the difference of the lesson. Does the means justify the end? Does the mean justify the end, right? And not a lot of other media types can convey that type of lesson that powerfully as video games can. So is that a waste of time as well? You can tell I'm very passionate about this because I've talked so fast in this episode, but there's still a lot I have to go through in terms of my notes, so don't worry. I'll slow down just a little bit. So then he said something about you can make a living out of the jiu-jitsu lessons and all of that, making a jiu-jitsu school. Well, you can also make a living off of video games. He said it himself later in that same clip and later in that same podcast. And the only reason why he downplayed the fact that you can make a living off of video games is because he said that you have to be adaptable and you have to be able to play multiple video games. So that just, to me, sounds like a very cop-out excuse, because you have to be adaptable to play basketball as well, right? Or to play football, soccer, whatever. You can't just play the same strategy every game because the opposite team will adapt and beat you since they know your game plan. And it's not a one-to-one comparison to, I don't know, moving from Halo to Call of Duty or things like that because Halo died or whatever. But wouldn't that mean that it would require more hard work and it would be more worth being an esports athlete because of the sheer skill and the sheer, desire and hard work it takes to be good at a video game? If you have to be adaptable and all of those things, doesn't that mean that being an esport athlete add up to more skill than being a basketball player? It's weird. I don't know how to explain it, but if a basketball player never has to worry about basketball going out of fashion, but a video game player does have, a professional video game player does have to worry about their game going out of fashion, doesn't that mean that esports athletes know more of their skill set than a basketball athlete does? I'm playing devil's advocate. I don't think that is true. I think it's equal. They're completely different skill sets, so you can't really compare them. I'm just playing devil's advocate here. And athletes are already pretty resourceful in how they manage their life after they retire, because you can only be a basketball player for so long, and after that you have to find other sources of revenue, because most players can't just live off of infinite, like they can't just live until they die out of their basketball savings or out of their football savings. Only the very, very top players can actually do that. So what's the problem in being resourceful and adaptable during their careers, and being able to apply your skill set across multiple things? Like most esports athletes that eventually retire become incredible streamers because their skill set still works, and because they just generally have a good personality due to being exposed in the public space all the time. So what's the problem with being adaptable? What's the problem with being, having to play multiple video games? If anything, if you love video games, that just means you have more things you enjoy and more things to do, and wouldn't be classified as a waste of time. So with all of that out of the way in terms of the video games viewpoint, I have a problem as a whole for what Joe Rogan said, like taking out of context the video game example, right? Joe Rogan is basically saying that spending time doing something that won't move your career further is a waste of time, which is just an awful way of living and experiencing your life. There's no way that Joe Rogan doesn't do something in his day-to-day life that gives him a little bit of relief or decompression from the everyday work, like watching an episode of a series or playing video games himself, as he has mentioned in the past that he has done and he regularly does. So spending time to unwind is important. We're not machines that have only one purpose and set of instructions to follow. Leisure time is as important as work time, because if you're constantly burning yourself out from your job, you'll perform worse at it and you won't be able to further your career forward, which is from what Joe Rogan has been talking about in that clip, and from what his meaning is trying to convey is all about, right? Leisure time is as important as work time, because there has to be a balance between working and getting the bread and spending time for yourself. You can't possibly always spend time working. It's just inhuman. Now that we have discussed that, I also want to talk about why Joe Rogan said is right. Because if we take a step back even further, Joe Rogan is talking about the idea of an addiction, right? He started off with saying video games are a real problem. Why? Because they're fun. You do them, you get really excited, but you don't get anywhere, right? That sort of speaks more, especially when you watch the whole podcast and have the context around it, speaks more about the idea of an addiction. The clip is meant to talk about the people who spend their entire day playing video games and how their personal life is at a detriment for it. Playing video games to a sickening amount impacts not only your economic stability if you sacrifice your work and your economic, influx, but it also impacts you physically and sometimes even mental health to a certain extent, because not seeing other people, not working out, all of those things can impact your mental health quite severely. Playing games as a job also requires time out of the job, like any other job. Something that doesn't actually happen that often, sadly. Esports teams make their players live in a house with their teammates and play 24/7, and game streamers, due to the nature of their job, usually don't do much socializing outside of voice chatting with another streamer while they're playing, and they're constantly rewarded, sort of like how YouTubers are, with consistency and a lot of content being put out in the platform that they're, streaming in. So I understand what Joe Rogan is saying, in that, if you put that much time into something, it will lead to, a worse quality of life. However, that is in direct contrast to it being a waste of time, right? Because if it's bringing the money, it's not a waste of time. Basically, to wrap all of that up, moderation is the key to everything in life, right? Food, entertainment, job. You can't just eat forever. You'll get sick, you'll throw up. There's a limit to how much you can eat. You can't work 24 hours a day because you need to sleep. You can't work 24 hours a day because you'll just burn yourself out. You can't always be entertained. You can't always watch movies, play games, because you won't have the money from your job to buy food to survive in the world, in the capitalist world we live in, right? So addictions are wrong in any shape or form, even with jiu-jitsu. Yes, you might be swole as fuck during it, but if you don't have any food on your plate because of it, then maybe it isn't a great idea to do it at all. Video games as an excessive is bad because you won't be putting the time where it matters, but jiu-jitsu is at an excessive is also bad. The same way that eating fast food at an excessive is also bad. Addictions are wrong no matter the shape they take, and we all need to live in moderation. Thank you so much for listening through today's episode. It's a much shorter episode than the usual. It's just something that I was very passionate about talking, and it was topical, and I thought, hey, I'll put my head in the ring and I'll throw my opinion in. With that said, a week from now, it's my birthday. There will be a very special birthday podcast episode on Friday, August 7th. And it'll just be me rambling on things about my life. It'll probably be a short episode like this one, but you never know. If you want some more random entertainment, check out my Twitch stream, LucaTony0708, where we play games and react to funny videos. I'm going to be having a special birthday stream where you can all impact my Minecraft game by making it impossible to beat, by spawning things, and it'll be a lot of fun. With all of that said, thank you for spacing out.